Uh, all right. Well, thank you so much for joining us for talking about what it's like to go to therapy. As many of you know, I'm Becca Toms, and I work with Solid Ground and UConn Extension to try to provide resources for farmers. But tonight, I'm wearing a little bit of a different hat. I am going to talk about my experience as an individual who has attended therapy. So I have been farming for a little over 10, 11 years at various farms doing different things. And during that time, I have often found it helpful as well to take time out of those busy farm days to take care of myself. And one of the best ways that I have found to take care of myself in helping cope with some of the stresses that we encounter on a regular basis is by just going to talk therapy. And we'll get more into that a little bit later, but I want you all to also meet Alana, and she's going to tell you a little bit about herself.
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad we're finally doing this. I feel like it has been years in the making of us saying, like, we're going to do something together. We're going to do something together. Like every time we have a presentation on farmer mental health, we find each other and we're finally doing it. So I appreciate you for thinking of me for this and for the opportunity. Very happy to co-present with you. So by way of introduction, I'm Alana DiPesa Truelove. I say that I am married to a farm because I'm married to Tom Truelove, who started Truelove Farms about 11 years ago in Morris, Connecticut, where he raises livestock out on pasture. So I'm also a therapist. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and I'm in private practice where I see patients of my own and now also do a bit of farmer mental health work in addition to that. But I like to say I'm a therapist by day and a farmer by night because that's when the cows always seem to get out. So chasing the cows, collecting the eggs, processing the chickens, selling at our store, I feel like that's all I moonlight, on the farm on occasion. But my actual paid work is as a therapist. And I've been a therapist now for I guess I should have figured this out beforehand. Probably, I guess now about 8, 9 years that I've been in practice. But I come from a family of therapists. Every single person that I'm related to by blood is a therapist. So if you want to talk about the family business, this is it. Family farms and family therapy. So I have always been drawn to therapy, and I really grew up around it, sort of hearing it secondhand from my mom. So certainly that's my bread and butter. But when I met Tom, it became very clear that there was no shortage of stress and mental health concerns in the farm world either. So that crossover really happened very quickly. I think that he started talking about the very unique stressors of farming and of being related to being a farmer on our first date. I remember vividly him saying, like, well, I'm kind of in this place where I have to like scale up or scale down because there's no in between in farming. And, I have to figure out what I'm going to do financially. And I don't have any labor force. And I don't know if I want to do this. And I was like, oh boy, wow. Okay. So this is a therapy session, which I am no stranger to. But it was then that I was like, this is clear that this is a stressful profession that you are in. And that was going to be a perennial part of our relationship, was sort of navigating the stress that came from the farm. So we got through that, and we obviously have figured out a way to have a relationship in spite of all that stress that he has. But maybe because maybe he was smart to marry a therapist, actually, come to think of it. And so the way that we finally realized that this was not only a benefit for him to have a therapist in his life, but that maybe I had a unique lens, was when Farm Aid came to Connecticut a few years back. We were at the farmers market, and the communications folks were sort of making the rounds, and they talked to us and asked about who we were and what we did. And when they found out that I was a therapist and obviously he's a farmer, they were very interested in that and really wanted to know more about that dynamic and had us come out and speak on a panel. And so since then, I've sort of wound up falling into, I guess, this position of being able to talk a bit more about the connection between farming and mental health, and sort of being a voice for farmer mental health within the state, and then a bit on a national scale with a couple of podcasts like the Female Farmer Project and some other organizations who are doing some really good work around farmer mental health, just, advocating and collaborating on that. So that's basically how my farming experience happened. And I think I'll talk a little bit more later on too about my theoretical orientation within as a therapist, and I'm sure you guys will get a flavor for who I am as a therapist too. But that's how I got into this strange niche area of farmer mental health, is really a personal connection, and then other people saying like, hey, that's a cool connection and we should capitalize on that.
Yeah. And to add on to that, one of the reasons that I reached out to Alana about doing this specific topic is because I'm an advocate for therapy, going myself and knowing many people that have gone to therapy. And I have often found myself having conversations with farmers about what it's like and sharing my experience of what it was like to go to therapy and answering questions about it because they were on the fence. So, I just thought that it would be really appropriate to just sit down and actually talk about it in a way where people could have this as something to refer back to, or to maybe ease some of the potential discomfort that is kind of surrounds that first toe dip into therapy. So
Yeah, I really love that this was the way that you decided to broach this topic, because I think that you and I have said too, so often the conversation about farmer mental health is around the high rates of suicide amongst farmers. And yes, that is alarming, and that is one big part of the concern with farmer mental health, but that's not all of it. And I think by and large, the majority of farmers may not be feeling suicidal. Like, let's hope that they're not feeling suicidal. But they're probably feeling stressed, because this profession is incredibly stressful.
Yeah.
I often say when I'm asked to speak on farmer mental health, I often feel like I'm in this weird predicament where I feel like it means I have to like sing the blues about farming, like that like everything is so hard in farming. And it's like, there's so much beauty and joy in the folks who choose this way of life, and in the work that gets done, and in being so close to the land and the animals. But so many qualities that make farming so appealing for often are incredibly stressful too. The isolation of it, the inconsistency of it, the lack of financial security, the strain on the relationships because you're married to your farm, married to your job, and the high expectations. These days in our area, at least, Becca, I'm sure you can speak to this, anybody who's farming in Connecticut is not doing it to get rich. So you are dedicated to this work. You really believe in it. You have incredibly strong convictions. But that means often that if you're holding yourself to such a high standard, it's a long way to fall too.
Well, let's dive into it. We have some questions that Alana and I have talked about beforehand. So, we'll just go with it. So, one of the first things that we'll talk about is, when should you talk to a therapist? My initial answer is whenever you want. There is you don't have to be at an extreme, like at the end of your rope to go see a therapist. So I think you want to talk.
That's a really good point, that yes, whenever you want, and whenever you feel like something's not quite right. Like I would rather people come to therapy before they're at the end of their rope, because that's when we can actually make some tangible change. Not to say, also come if you're at the end of your rope, please still come. But before then, like, we have more flexibility, we have more wiggle room to actually make a change. In my life, I've gone to therapy because I was curious. Like, when I was in grad school, I was like, oh, I should probably be on the other side of the chair here. And so I just went because I was curious once. I went because like something like something wasn't quite right. I was having a lot of trouble focusing and I was feeling more anxious than usual. And then I went another time because I was like, I should be less stuck than I am. I was at a point in my life where I was just very stuck and I couldn't put my finger on why I was stuck. So not anything, not major, huge mental health concerns, but times where I just felt like I needed a little help from somebody who wasn't related to me or didn't have a stake in my life necessarily.
Yeah. And for me, my first time going to therapy was actually in college. And the reason I went was because someone that I really trusted said that I should go. Kind of a mentor sort of person, probably also someone who was like, oh my gosh, this 20-something-year-old, she needs to get her life together. I'm exhausted dealing with no, she's a great person, but it was something that was really intimidating for me because unlike your family, my family was very much, you keep things together. Nothing goes outside of our bubble. And that was difficult for me in my teens and early 20s because I had a dad who was disabled from injury. I had family members that were struggling with addiction, and I had also my own just feelings of life that I was trying to navigate. And I just was so overwhelmed and didn't know what to do and didn't even know that therapy was an option for me because it was always framed as it was something for people that were really messed up. That, if you're going to therapy, in essence, you failed at being able to take care of yourself. When in reality now, I know that it's the opposite. I think that if you're going to therapy, you're thriving and taking care of yourself. But that's a side note. So yeah, it was, for me, that first step into therapy really needed to be a little bit more of a push for me, because I struggled to make the decision on my own. But when I eventually found a therapist that worked for me, it turned out to be so beneficial. And we'll talk about good fits and bad fits later. But, that's kind of the starting point of when do I go to therapy? Again, whenever you want. But some of those big barriers to getting to therapy can be yourself and how therapy is viewed.
Right, absolutely. It's interesting. I mean, certainly, I think you're right that so many people hold that view of it's for people who are really messed up or really sick or something like that. And I think this stereotype of shrinks, exists too, where it's very scary to think of going and talking to a therapist. Often early in my career, when I would tell people what I did, they'd be like, "Oh, I'm not talking to you. I don't need any analysis. Thank you very much." And so it's a scary topic. But then the other side of it is, I think that people think you also need to be like, if they don't have that perspective that you have to be very screwed up, then I think that the idea is that you have to be very wealthy to be able to afford therapy. That therapy must be a luxury, because we think of things like, The Sopranos and all sorts of, movies and TV shows where people are going to therapy and it's very traditional sort of psychoanalysis. Likely it's a psychiatrist that they're meeting with. It's not typically shown to be, I mean, nowadays it's a little bit more like realistic of what it's supposed to be. But years ago, it wasn't. It was, you're lying on the couch, you're talking to somebody who's just saying, and it is probably this idea of incredibly expensive treatment that is not accessible to the general public.
So that lends quite nicely into looking for a therapist because, to be honest, sometimes it is hard to be accessible. I mean, there's not all therapists take insurance. You have to navigate what your insurance covers. Sometimes the therapist you want isn't covered by insurance. So, it's not a perfect system yet. We're working on it. as the collective we of the world, I guess. But how do you look for a therapist? How do you find a therapist? Obviously insurance is one of the first things. So I guess we'll talk about that a little.
Yeah, I'd certainly be curious to hear what your experience has been too, of how did you look for a therapist. But I'll tell you the general rule of thumb, I would say, is to start with your insurance. Your insurance company has a list of every provider, every therapist who is paneled by them. So if you're looking to use your insurance, first place to start would be with them. Though you can also sort of cross-reference that nowadays with Psychology Today or any other online search platforms for therapists to see if they have a profile. You can usually see a picture of the person. You get a little bit of information about what their specialties might be or areas of interest. And it does typically also say what insurances they take and if they have a wait list or if they're accepting new patients at the time that you're looking.
Yeah. So Psychology Today is actually one of the ways that I find a therapist. I mean, back when I first started going to therapy, it was, I think, sheer luck that I found a good fit the second time that I went. The first time that I went, it was just the college therapist. It was someone that was recommended to me, and the easiest, most accessible one. And I didn't know what I was doing anyways. So I just was like, okay, I'll just sit in the chair in front of somebody. Just put me in front of somebody. I don't know what I'm doing.
Right.
So basically the first stint of therapy was just sitting in a chair with whoever was put in front of me. And that didn't work out.
Right. Of course not. I mean, I was just going to say, it's so scary to do that. Your first time in therapy and you're just sitting across from somebody that you basically had no hand in picking.
Yeah.
That must have been really hard.
Yeah. I basically thought that she thought I was stupid. To be honest, which probably is not true. But in general, it wasn't a good fit. So, and again, I think we can talk about good fit and bad fit a little bit later down the line. But nowadays, because I've kind of expanded my social network, and also I'm just more aware of the resources to me. One of the things that I do is I do use Psychology Today, and I literally scroll through these pictures and profiles of therapists and try to find someone that accepts my insurance and is in the area. That doesn't always work either. So with my most recent one, therapist, it actually happened at the suggestion of my primary care physician.
Mm-hmm.
So I told her outright that, I was doing okay, but I felt like I needed to talk to somebody, and I was having trouble finding someone that seemed to fit well that took my insurance. So right away, she was able to suggest somebody that she trusted and that she approved of, that she thought would be a good fit for me. And that can be a really good way if you have a primary care physician that knows you pretty well and that you connect with. They are, already in the field in some way, shape, or form, and often do have some of these crossover connections. So they may be able to help you as well. And then also it's been just by word of mouth, like friends saying, this person's awesome. So.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. What you just said made me think, we're sort of talking, so far, we're talking about traditional therapy. Like we're talking about that one-on-one kind of long-term, as long as you may need it sort of treatment, but there are many different types of therapy too. So talking to your PCP, your primary care provider, is a really good idea, because a lot of times there are sort of more focused, brief forms of treatment available in primary care practices, or that they kind of consult with or collaborate with. So you can certainly access that. And that's kind of, I like to think of that as kind of therapy light, or like dipping your toe into therapy. Like if you're not sure if you want to do traditional therapy every week or every other week for, 6 months, a year, whatever, you might just start with 3 or 4 sessions with the therapist, in your primary care office, or somebody who does brief treatment specifically, and see how that feels. And a lot of good change can happen in that. I worked in that capacity, and I was able to do a lot of work around insomnia and stress management and anxiety reduction skills, and, acknowledging, like, anticipating when depression is going to come on and how do you prevent that. So it's a lot of psychoeducation. It's a lot of skills building. But for somebody who's new to therapy, a lot of times that's a nice way to start. Um, and then, of course, there's traditional therapy. And then there are higher levels of care beyond that, which are more like intensive forms of treatment, either daily or even beyond that. But good to at least start with whoever you may be seeing for healthcare in general. Even if you don't have a PCP that you see regularly, if you have an OBGYN as a woman, or if a female-bodied person, or if you have an endocrinologist, a dermatologist, ask any of the medical providers in your life to say, do you have anybody who you might recommend for this? Because pretty much there's always crossover, like you're saying.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, also when you're working with someone in the medical field, they'll also have a little bit of knowledge about insurance, like,
Mm-hmm.
will your insurance cover this? What is your insurance covering? So again, it makes sense. Like for me, with my primary care physician, this was someone that was actually in the practice, just in extended other sort of building and section of the work. So it was easy to know that my insurance was covering it, and that it wasn't going to be costing me a lot. But I do have to say, there have been times that I did go to therapy with someone who didn't take my insurance. And the reason I went is because I knew she was really good. She was a really great therapist that I really was able to get a lot of work done with. And she was willing to work with me a little bit when I was honest about my cost limits. So, instead of every week, we would meet every 2 or 3 weeks. Since I would pay her cash, so I would pay a little bit lower than the normal price, and things like that. So it's always okay to have that conversation as well with whoever you're talking to.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that lots of folks do have a sliding scale, or they're willing to sort of accommodate you in different ways. And it certainly doesn't hurt to ask. I think I would say, like, just as, of course, we would prefer that customers not try to haggle with us about the products that we're selling.
Definitely.
I can't tell you how many times people were like, I'll give you $10 for that bacon instead of $16.
Gosh.
And I was like, no, it is what it is. We're going to sell it either way. But so, like, in the same way, obviously therapists do have a rate that actually encompasses all of their costs, like the rent of their office space, whatever device they might be using, or system they might be using if you're seeing them through telehealth, plus their years of, like, their schooling that they are likely still paying student loans on, and
insurance
all of
that they need to pay,
malpractice insurance, licensure fees. Like, there's a lot that goes into it. So the going rate is typically 100 or more, I would say, for a typical therapy session, just to give folks a sense. But if it's covered by your insurance, and if you don't have a high deductible, you may just pay $5 for your copay, or nothing. I have lots of folks who have a copay that's $0. But if it's outside of your scope, if you have a high deductible, or if the person doesn't take insurance, certainly it doesn't hurt to ask about a sliding scale, or to say, do they have any, sort of like pro bono, or any time that they could sort of flex their visits with you so that you could see them less frequently, to make it more affordable.
Yeah. Because honestly, these people, they're in the profession because they want to help. So, it's obviously they still have to make a living, but they also want to help.
Right. Right.
Um, and then I guess still on the topic of how do you look for a therapist? I know we talked a little bit about types of therapy, and you talked about the different ways of intensity of practice, I should say. But I mean, there's also different like methods.
Yeah.
So to be honest, like there was a good chunk of my life where I was a practicing Christian. And one of the things that I really wanted to look for in a therapist was that they were also a Christian. You know, I don't look for that now, but that is something that you can look for. There's also folks that specialize in, you know, women's issues, LGBTQ, um, teens, things like that. And then even further, there's different practices that are utilized, which I will not talk to because
Yeah, I mean, exactly right. So, using any of these sorting sort of websites like Psychology Today, you can filter by certain things. So you can filter by like only show me female therapists, or only show me Christian therapists, or only show me Black therapists. And then beyond that, you can say only show me Black therapists who accept United Healthcare insurance and who specialize in treatment of farmers. That's not on there, although it should be. You know, who
we're working on it.
specialize. Yeah, work on that. That should be our next initiative.
Yeah.
You know, but they might specialize in a certain area, like treating men, for instance, or treating women or something like that. And then beyond that, then they might have, you could also filter by, or you could at least read and see what their areas, like the modalities that they use or their areas of specialty. So most folks are familiar with CBT, which is cognitive behavioral therapy. It's kind of become like the colloquial way of referring to therapy. A lot of times medical providers will say, oh, you just need some CBT, and it's, you know, cognitive behavioral therapy. But cognitive behavioral therapy is a specific type of therapy. It's, you know, all these different types of therapy are focused on a different sort of premise or a different way of healing, treating folks. So cognitive behavioral therapy is one way of saying your thoughts inform your feelings, inform your behavior, and, you know, we can treat you we can treat all three of those different things to get you feeling better. There's EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, which is a form of trauma therapy. So folks who've experienced trauma often might want to filter by EMDR therapists or just trauma therapists. You know, you can focus that way. You can focus by anxiety folks who specialize in anxiety disorders. And there are, but the thing is, I mean, I think it's important to say these different treatment modalities so that folks know you're not just sitting there talking to a therapist. And if you are, that's probably not great therapy. You know, if the therapist is literally just chatting with you, I can't tell you how many folks come to me and are like, my last therapist just like chatted with me. It felt like I was talking to a friend, but paying a friend a lot of money to talk to me.
Yeah.
That's not great. So it should feel like you are actually getting something new from this experience that you might not be getting from a friend or from somebody else in another capacity in your life. And that would be because they are doing a specific treatment modality with you, or they're at least, you know, providing you some education and guidance based on a modality.
So, yeah, there's so many different types of therapy and so many different folks that will specialize in different things. But again, it's finding your fit, you know. Some treatment modalities may fit you better than others, and you may not know that until you try it. And it's okay if you say in the midst of going to therapy, you know, I'm not sure, explain to me the modality that we're using again and what's going on with it. I'm not sure if I understand it. I'm not sure if it's a good fit. You know, like be honest and open and let the therapist know.
Yeah. I have certain things that I feel like work really well generally, and I'll start doing something with somebody and they'll be like, I don't like this. I'm like, oh, okay, good. Okay, so this doesn't work for you. Let's try this other thing over here. You know, and so I can't know that if they don't tell me. You know, otherwise, I mean, I should know because I can see like they're like, oh, this is uncomfortable. I don't like it. But it's really important just to be upfront about that. It's your treatment. You know, the therapist works for you.
Mhm.
So if it's not feeling helpful, then something's got to give. And I know we're going to get to like, what do you do when it's not feeling
Yeah,
helpful?
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So before we get to that, I know we want to talk a little bit about the first appointment.
Mhm.
Um, so uh, I'll just, I mean, there's lots of things that we could talk about in regards to that, but I guess I'll talk about my experience first, and then if you want to talk a little bit about just in general what people can expect, and other also experiences yourself that you've had,
Yeah.
like, but um, honestly, the first appointment for me is still kind of hard. So the last first appointment that I had, I mean, the reason I was going to therapy is because I was at a high level of stress and I was um, feeling overwhelmed by it. And after the first session with this therapist, who turned out to be really great, I just cried because it was just so much to talk about out loud what I was dealing with, and already kind of feeling at a high level of stress and overwhelmedness.
Mhm.
Um, so, you know, I've been to like 6 different therapists or more. I don't even know. I'm not really counting. um, and there's still a little bit of like
Yeah.
when I go into it, because it's a very vulnerable sort of step to take. Um, and you know that that will probably always be the case because we're humans and we're offering something that is delicate of ourselves to another human.
Mhm.
So, I mean, that was just the most recent one. But as I said before, my first time going to therapy, I had a lot of different things to deal with. And one of it was that I wasn't even sure if I was supposed to, like, what the therapist thought of me. Like, there was the nagging feeling in the back of my head that, I don't know, are they going to commit me? Which had happened to a family member. So that's another
But is
story.
very, very rare.
But it's very, very rare. That's what I was about to say. I was
Good.
gonna follow it up. Yeah, so that in and of itself does not happen very often. And it was just, you know, one of the things that I think people do fear about because of TV and different things, but in reality, that's not what happens very often.
Yeah.
And then also just feeling like, again, as I said earlier, feeling like the person thought I was stupid, that they would think less of me for needing help with dealing with stuff. And I don't think that's the case because therapists have these conversations with people over and over again. They're all about the empowering of people and the strengths that you have.
Yeah.
Um, but for me, having that mindset of only really messed up people go to therapy, um, it kind of, one of the key words of, I projected, I put this upon the therapist to think of me as stupid because that's how I felt about myself, I think.
Yeah.
Um, so it's it's not easy. Um, and it took me a couple of sessions to really settle into the fact that it was okay for me to be in therapy and I wasn't a failure and I wasn't failing.
Yeah.
Uh, it actually took me 2 therapists. I didn't reach that point with the first therapist.
Yeah.
Um, so, yeah.
How important though to be able to recognize that and to get there and to keep trying, you know, like good kudos to you, because that's hard to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that just sort of like bare bones of what to expect in an initial session, I think you can expect a lot of questions. You know, it sort of feels like a very personal interview sometimes. But it should be like, to be clear though about that, you can say no to anything that is being asked. If you're not at that point and you're not ready, you know, if somebody, every therapist does it differently. Basically, in order to be able to bill, if we're billing your insurance, there are certain criteria that we have to have met. We have to have been able to get a general psychosocial, it's called, which is essentially just an assessment of your whole life, more or less, you know, your family and your medical history and any legal history or substance use history and all of that stuff. So if they're asking you questions like that, it's not because they think that you are a criminal and you know, drug user. It's because like we have to just kind of, that's our spiel. We have to ask those questions. But again, if you're not comfortable with something, like if they ask about trauma history, which is a really common question, not necessarily to say, tell me all your traumas, but a lot of times we do ask, have you experienced any trauma? So that might be, if you're not feeling comfortable, that could be something to say, like, I don't feel comfortable answering that yet. And can we talk about, you know, other presenting issues or other parts of this first? So the client always has the authority to redirect. The therapist may ask certain things, may kind of open up the possibility for certain questions, but again, it's your session, it's your time, it's your money. So make sure that you're directing it in a way that feels helpful to you.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, one of the things that sometimes, regardless of the therapist, like I know that it's what they're doing is for billing, but like the rating scale, and like, so on the scale of 1 to 5, how depressed have you been in the last 2 weeks? I'm like,
how depressed are you?
Yeah. I have to come up with a number for this. I don't know. I'm just, what does 5 mean? Does 5 mean? So, I mean, yeah. And it's okay, as I have done, because I just say what I want to say, I guess now. But I literally will tell the therapist, I'm having a hard time rating this. I'm not sure. Maybe we can come back to this question next week or something like that. And that's perfectly fine. Right. You know, yes, it is for billing and for documentation, but they don't have to have everything set in stone the first session. Things can be followed up on.
Exactly. And there are other ways for them also to get that information. Like anybody who's had a baby, you go to your pediatrician, your first pediatrician visit, and they give you an Edinburgh depression scale, and they're like, no, mom, this is for you. Like, this isn't about your kid, this is about you. Mm-hmm. But really, that's just because they want to get a quick assessment, like, is mom experiencing postpartum depression? But you know how else they're going to find that out is if you're crying the entire visit.
Yeah.
You know, as I have done. So, but I was like, my scores were all 0. I wasn't depressed, but boy, was I tearful. Mm-hmm. So, you know, it's just more information. They're just looking to get more information about you. And so if the rating scale is not for you, or if it feels too personal or strange in a way, you can say, like, this isn't working for me, but how about you ask me some of the questions that you're trying to get at with this, and we can figure it out.
Yeah. So, first appointment, it can be a doozy. And also it can kind of feel a little bit discouraging as a client, because you're like, so what did we accomplish here?
Right.
You know, and
the first appointment's the most expensive. So if you look at your bill, you're like, wait a minute, what? She just asked me a bunch of questions and I have to pay all this money? But don't worry, it gets better.
Yeah. It's just like you would like prep your soil for planting seeds. You don't want to have a therapist that isn't aware of the needs of their plant, to use some farming analogies that are kind of corny. But you know, you want to know what's going on with your soil's health. You want to know what's going on with the mother if you're wanting to have like calves or lambs. You need to know these backgrounds in order to properly care for and address what's going on.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. yeah, the first session is a lot of prep work for what's to come. And so if you can make it through that and not think that your therapist thinks you're stupid, or like not be like really put off by, I don't know, whatever, the tone of their voice or their office or whatever, if it feels like I can tolerate this, I would say try to at least come back for a second and third session, because that's when you might really get into the meat of things.
Yeah, yeah. And that goes into the good fit versus bad fit and the shopping around.
Yeah, tell us about that. I'm really eager to hear about your good bad fits.
Oh gosh, I won't go into all the details about the bad fits.
Tell us their names, where they
yeah.
live. We want all the details.
No, but you know, one of my now at this point in my life, one of my common rules for myself is when I'm looking for a new therapist is to give them at least 3 sessions. Sometimes I give them more because it is hard to really figure out and see what your fit is. So for one person, I gave them, I think, like 7 sessions. And I was really hemming and hawing about it, and came to the point where I was like, you know what? No, I don't think that this is the right fit for me. But it was okay. You know, a therapist recognizes that just as in life, people are going to connect in different ways, and it all has to do with personalities or also different ways of working, you know. Just like you have different coworkers that you meld with, it doesn't mean that those coworkers are any less good at their job or farming or whatever. It's just that they're different.
Yeah.
So for me, at first, I thought I'm going to use the term breaking up with my therapist was going to really hurt their feelings. And I was just so worried about hurting my therapist's feelings that I stayed longer than I should have, because literally I was just paying to just go, and it was literally a painful experience. I would just go and pay someone to leave and feel like I had not accomplished anything yet again.
Yeah.
So don't do that, everybody.
Right.
But it's also understandable. Like a lot of people are compassionate and don't like to. They think that someone will take it as a personal affront if they say that therapy's not working for them with this individual. That's not the case, as I have found out. So for me, the bad fit individuals, it mostly had to do with just their style, because there is the practice, like you were talking about CBT and things like that, but there's also just an individual style that people will integrate because they're humans. And that's natural. And also what makes therapy great is that you get to experience each person's personality and then how they interpret these different practices. So, you know, I know that many people that I have talked to have also ghosted their therapists when they didn't feel like it was a good fit. They just stopped returning calls and emails and whatever, and just like disappeared off the face of the earth, which I may have done. I can't remember now. But I think more often I've just, not always face to face, because that is hard. But over email or over a phone call, said, I don't really feel like this is the best fit for me. I think I'm going to try somebody else and see if I can find something that works a little bit better. And they may ask for reasons why, and it's okay to tell them, like if there's something specific that comes to mind, let them know. It's perfectly fine. And
Yeah.
they will not, it will not be the end of their world. They will not be crushed.
Right. Yeah.
So, because of that, I have gone through quite a few different therapists because I have made the decision that if I'm going to be spending my money, because my insurance doesn't fully cover therapy, I have to pay $40 a visit after the first couple. If I'm going to be spending that money, I want to make sure that it's working and it's a good fit,
Right.
because otherwise I'm just like throwing money into the air, which I don't think any farmer or
Nobody has
person
enough
in
of.
general wants to do.
Right.
So,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, and I think that, research shows that 90% of the effectiveness of therapy has to do with the fit between the therapist and the client. Whether it doesn't actually matter the theoretical orientation or the modality being used, that's not nearly as important as if the client and therapist said that they were a good match for one another.
Mm-hmm.
If you feel like you can trust your therapist and that there's somebody that you enjoy talking to, and that, you kind of feel like you jive, you can talk easily with one another, that's a much bigger indicator as to whether or not you're going to be successful in therapy than what is actually happening in the therapy.
Yeah. So, and then, those things that you just said, like, those are all the things that I looked for in a good fit, is if I felt comfortable, as much as I could on like the first visit. If it felt like it was natural. Also, if I felt, this may sound silly, but if I felt like I was pausing to think about the answers to the questions that they were asking me. Sometimes some therapists take an approach where they'll talk a little bit more than other therapists. So, they'll be talking and I'll be absorbing, and then there'll be a response that is elicited from me, and I will it'll be something that I have to think about, or it's something that I kind of run off. So for me, when I'm in that sort of space, I don't necessarily jive well with therapists who do more of the instructional and talking sort of approach, which can be super helpful for some folks, but for me, that's not a good fit. And it's also a good indicator for me if I have to pause, and I'll look up into the corner, usually is what I do, and think about what I'm going to say, because that means that I'm really being drawn into that process for me.
Yeah, that's really good to be able to have those cues to assess whether it's working for you. I think it's different for every person how but I also think, so the thing is, therapy is basically like a microcosm of every relationship that you're in. So if you find yourself doing something with your therapist, it's really good to tell your therapist that you see yourself doing that. I started with a new client probably about a month ago now. And in our second or third session, she was like, I just find myself really wanting to make you laugh. Like every time you laugh, I'm like, yes, I made her laugh. And I was like, that's interesting. Do you do that in other parts of your life? And she's like, 100%. Like, absolutely. I use humor as a defense, like all the time. But it was this really interesting moment where she's like, I really want you to like me. Like, I want to be your best client. And I was like, okay, so like, let's work on that. Let's talk about how that shows up in other parts of your life.
Oh my gosh, I totally relate to that woman.
Right? Yeah, I mean, I said back to her, I said, well, don't worry, because I really like it when I make my clients laugh too. So it's okay. I get it. But like, so whatever's coming up in therapy likely is reflected in other parts of your life too. So there's no harm in saying that.
Yeah.
You know, I
Yeah.
think I told you, but when we were prepping for this, I said, like, I told my second therapist that had the same first name as my mother, like, so you're the second Linda I've gone to. And she's like, that's weird. But that we worked on it. We're like, okay, so
Mhm.
what's that about? Why am I
Mhm.
seeking out therapists with my mother's name? Um, you know, it's okay to say those sorts of things. And if you can say it anywhere, it's in therapy. Like, we
Mhm.
expect sort of
Mhm.
weird inner working world stuff to come up, and none of it is actually very weird. All the time people are like, I'm going to tell you something that I've never told anybody, and it is so intense. And they tell me, and I'm like, yeah, I've heard worse. So of course I don't minimize it to them in that
Right, right,
regard,
right,
but just like FYI, the therapist has heard worse. So pretty
right.
much
Mhm.
anything you say is going to be fine.
Yeah. Yeah. So, um, yeah. So I mean, definitely, I think the moral of the story is shop around.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's
Yep.
it's not easy. Um, as I referenced before, like my first stint with therapy did not go well, and it took me, I think, 2 years to try the next therapist
Yeah.
in on the same practice, actually. But it was just someone different, um, and it worked amazingly. Um, it was just the fit
Mm-hmm.
that didn't work that first time. And I was telling myself that initially that therapy just wasn't for me, that it
Yeah.
didn't work. But in reality, it was the fit. And I found that out because I was lucky enough to find the right therapist on the second
Mm-hmm.
try and saw how much it could impact me and have a positive sort of role in where I was headed and helping me figure things out.
Right.
So, I just say that because it can be really discouraging
Mm-hmm.
to feel like, in essence, you're going to these strangers one by one and kind of opening yourself up with these really sensitive areas, um, especially with those first uh, sessions, um, and it can feel a little painful to go through that process. Uh, and especially if you're already feeling down, to feel a little bit more defeated, thinking that you can't find someone to help you. Like, it
Yeah.
can be discouraging, but um, there is somebody out there that's a good fit for you, and it just takes some perseverance sometimes, which again is super hard. But I'm going to take a moment real quick to say, I think both Alana and I are available to suggest therapists if anyone is watching this and is like,
Where do I
I just
begin?
don't know where to go.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
Yeah.
both of us, probably Alana more so than
Mm-hmm.
I, have knowledge of therapists in the area of Connecticut. And, we can help as much as we can in this
Yeah.
process. And I know we're open to it because it can feel sometimes a little bit defeating when
Yeah.
you're not finding that person right away.
Right.
So don't give up.
Right. Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. My long goal here for Farmer Mental Health is to actually create like a training program for therapists to actually be able to have a little bit more experience or understanding of the specific stressors, the unique stressors to farmers. And then ultimately, let's have a listserv where we can have like a little match.com where you can like look for your therapist who's trained in farmer mental health, and the farmers can decide who's the right fit. So someday that'll happen. But until then, you and I are sort of that. We will be that. We will link you. Yeah, we'll play
Exactly.
matchmaker.
Happy
Um,
to do it.
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Um, the other thing that just came to mind to me too when you said about in Connecticut with telehealth now, things have sort of changed a bit. So that's another thing to keep in mind when looking for a therapist is, are you comfortable doing this? Essentially, it's like Zoom,
Mhm, mhm.
or do you prefer an in-person session? And then filtering by that too, who's available in person versus just telehealth. Um, Websites, there are tons of websites, of course, like BetterHelp, that you can just see somebody just through telehealth. but I don't think any of those accept insurance. And so those are usually more on like sort of like a gym membership kind of way. Like you have a membership and you have a allotted number of sessions. And it sometimes, I've heard, can be harder to switch therapists if you don't feel like you have a good fit within that system. So just something to keep in mind too, there are lots of ways to access therapy these days. A lot of people say like, well, I have people who, go to college somewhere else, or they live out of state, but they got my name from somebody here and they want to see me. Unfortunately, our licensure restricts us to only practice in the states where we're licensed. So even if somebody, lives in Rhode Island, but, farms or works in Connecticut, unless they're physically located in Connecticut during the time of their session, I can't see them because I'm not licensed in Rhode Island. Right. So that's just a little quirky thing that telehealth has brought up lately.
Yeah. So if you do find your good fit, which I hope everybody eventually finds their good fit therapist, the next question I feel like people talk to me about is, how long do you have to go to therapy? And it really varies. So I am just finishing up a stint in therapy where I think it was like 10 sessions, maybe 11. The shortest one I've ever done, and it was super effective and it was great. And that's all that I needed. But I have also seen a therapist for a year straight, where I would see them every other week for an entire year. And then I think that ended because the therapist moved. Right. So, honestly, you don't want a therapist that you keep forever. That's not the point of therapy.
Yeah, we want you to get better. If the therapist is making you feel like it's going to be forever, that's not a good sign.
Yeah. So, if you're seeing someone for 5 years, maybe that's a little too long.
Well, and it's a time to ask yourself, what purpose is this serving? Is it just comfort at this point, or am I afraid of what's going to happen if I stop seeing this person? Or am I afraid to break up with them because I don't want to hurt their feelings? There's a lot of questions that come up at a point like that.
Yeah. So, it's okay to have a long stint of therapy, but it's also okay to have a short one. It really depends on your specific needs. So for me, that longer stint was, I think, the third therapist that I had ever been to, fourth therapist, because I shopped that time. And luckily found the second one really, again, I guess it's the second therapist for me, usually turns out good. But there were a lot of things that weren't addressed in the first time that I really got into therapy, because it was a short span of time, and then I had to move. So I was able to dig into years of stuff that I hadn't been able to deal with before, like, as I mentioned before, these family members with addiction, having my father be disabled, and what that was like, being the supporter of my family, who was also the youngest in my family, and being the emotional support for a family, like during my teenage years. So those can be big, heavy things that take a while to work through, as well as, addiction. I'll be honest that I have family members that have had addiction in their lives. There's been some moments where I've been nervous about my interaction with alcohol, so have cut that out. But it is not an easy thing. And sometimes if you have something that you are connected to, like an addiction, it's gonna take longer, because it's really hard. And it's also really helpful to have that support when you're trying to work through these things.
Right.
So it's okay for it to take a while if that's what you need and if that's what's helping.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, no hard and fast rules about how long it's going to take, but I think that you're right. It can be a handful of sessions up to a handful of years.
Yeah. So, but that's also a conversation that you want to be having with your therapist, and that your therapist should be having with you. Like, I think one really hard experience that I had with therapy is that my therapist forgot to tell me that she was leaving, which she was absolutely wonderful. And this was the one mistake that she made. She thought she had told me about the fact that she was moving and this is how many sessions we had left, and she hadn't. So, I was kind of like, what? Next session is our last session? What? But typically, that's part of the conversation is,
Right.
All right, what's my expectation for how long I may want to be in therapy? And based on what we're talking about, what's the therapist's expectation and thought? And obviously the therapist is going to be leaning on client. Like, one of my therapists told me, let's shoot for 10 sessions and see if it works. And if you need more, that's okay. But this is something that I'm putting out there at the beginning so that we have an understanding between the two of us.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, Alana, how do you usually deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, my style, I always give people an out in the first session. I always tell them, like, I'm not for everybody. And if I'm not for you, that's totally fine. So why don't you let me know if you want to schedule another appointment? And usually, they'll either tell me during the session, yes, I'd like another one, or they'll write to me after the fact and say yes or no, that they want another one. But then once I'm working with folks, and I hope that most therapists do this, but if not, it's something that as a client you could ask too. Midway through, after maybe 5 or 10 sessions or something, I'll say, how do you feel like this is going? Here's my assessment of what we've worked on so far and what I think we still have left to do. How do you feel about it? What would you like to see be different? Is there anything that you want more or less of in our time together? So if the therapist isn't asking you that, it's certainly your right as the client to come in and say, here's how I think this is going, and here's what I need, more or less of, or how long I'd like to see this go. And then, yeah, I think that what you're talking about as far as how long it goes, it leads right into the next topic of how do you know it's working, or how do you know when you're done, maybe. And that's a conversation I very often have where I will say to somebody, you seem better. And they're like, I think I am better. I'm like, okay, well, so then maybe we're done. And at that time, then we decide together, are you done, or are you done in terms of do you want to just take a break and call me if you need me, or do you want to just extend the time between our sessions to see how you do? There are so many options. It's not one size fits all sort of thing.
Yeah. And again, how in the terms of how do you know it's working? I mean, that is a very clear indicator if you feel like you're getting better. But along that same line, you can also feel like there's good work being done, but you're not feeling like you're progressing. I think there have been many times where I have been in therapy further back where I felt like things were really good and really valuable that we were doing, but I still felt like there was something that I just couldn't really get a grasp on and really get a hold of. So, ironically, again, my primary care physician suggested that I go on a low-grade antidepressant, which was something that I was terrified of, by the way. But, and I'll talk about that in a second. But in the end, it did work. So that, in addition to this talk therapy, kind of boosted the progress for me, because I felt like the medication was able to give me that just leg up where I couldn't get exactly to the level of work that I needed to do. And then when I started taking the medication and my body adjusted to it, because there is an adjustment period, it seemed to be more effective. And I was like, okay, I'm starting to feel like there's progress, and that I can actually think about moving on from this therapist and doing something, and just not going to therapy for a little while.
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, I don't know if you want to say something there before I launch into my struggle with medication.
No, I think it's smart to bring up medication too, because it does go hand in hand. I often say you don't need to be on meds to be in therapy, but you should be in therapy if you're on meds. Because it's, a pill is not a skill. One of my colleagues says that all the time. You're not going to actually make tangible change and long-lasting change with a medication. It's sort of a Band-Aid, and it's a necessary Band-Aid a lot of times, because if there is a true chemical imbalance due to many things, including, hormonal imbalance. I don't think that we think of that very often, but certainly there are certain periods of time in women's lives in particular where hormones are kind of out of whack, whether it be, like I mentioned earlier, postpartum period or in menopause. And a lot of times meds are the only thing that's really going to help to correct that. So there's no shame in that, in considering medication. And it's also what you just described. It can be a step stool. Like, if you're not getting where you feel like you need to get with therapy alone, then medication can help kind of give you that boost to then really be able to do the work that you need to be doing in therapy. And similarly to what we were saying about, like, how long will I be in therapy? You don't need to be on medication forever and ever. You can be on medication for a certain period of time to get through a certain sort of issue, or to, sort of level things back out again. I think it's perfectly normal and expected to try to come off meds and see how you're doing without it. And a lot of times people are like, oh no, still need it, still need to be on it. But that's how you find out whether or not you really do need to still be on it sometimes. And other times they'll say, actually, I feel fine because I've done all the work, the foundation building while I was on the medication, to be able to withstand whatever comes my way. And now I don't feel like I need it anymore. I don't need that crutch, in that way.
But as like it's again, that is not an easy step. For example, if you've never even been to therapy and then all of a sudden medication, what? As I mentioned before, like, medication for mental health was something that was told to me was for people that were really messed up.
Right.
Or conversely, it was something, in my experience, was also something where medication was having too much of an impact on family members' lives. And that was, again, projecting on my part. I had a family member that was on some psychotropic meds, which have a very different reaction with your body than the regular antidepressant that your therapist would suggest that you start with. No therapist is going to say, let's just jump right to the psychotropic medicine.
And most people don't need that also.
Yes, exactly.
It's really for more severe mental illness, or like you've trialed other antidepressant, anti-anxiety meds that haven't worked, and so then you need to go to that. But the first line is very mild. It's medications that are safe in even pregnancy and breastfeeding, which I think is important for people to know. Like it's safe enough for you to take at that very vulnerable time. So it's safe enough for you to take at any other
Yeah,
time
yeah.
in your life
So
too.
it was a super low dosage, but I mean, for me, like, again, I cry, guys, okay? But it was something that I remember sitting in the doctor's office and crying about because I felt like I was a failure again.
Yeah.
Um, that I had to go on medication and couldn't do this on my own. And again, I'm just going to say that was probably one of the best things for me to do was to go on that like things literally just went up for me from that point, and it was just a small dose. It was the lowest dosage.
Yeah, it just like levels things out a bit.
Yeah, and at first it felt a little bit weird. I'm not gonna lie. You can sense that there is a little bit of change, but you know, as my body adjusted to that, it just again, it just went up.
Right.
So
Yeah.
you know, it makes it less intimidating. It makes it easier for me to talk about now as something that is a tool in our toolbox rather than, as you were saying, Alana, as a crutch.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and you use it when you need it. You know, you might not always need it, but when you do, it can be really helpful to know you have that at your disposal.
So, not not too scary, guys. So we talked about a lot of things. Missed anything? I know we want to talk about what it's like to end therapy, which we've kind of touched on a little bit.
Yeah.
But yeah, are there other things that we didn't really touch on that you feel like?
I think this is a pretty good broad overview of what to expect from therapy. What to expect when you're therapying.
When you're hoping to get some help.
Right.
Yeah, and that's really what it is. I mean, when it comes down to it, it's a little bit of help. Just like when you have the ability to hire a farmhand to help you on your farm, you're going to take that opportunity. I mean, not everybody has that opportunity to hire someone to help with their business.
Yeah.
But we all have the opportunity to take some steps to help with our well-being.
Yeah.
Not to say that they're easy steps to take. Again, as I mentioned before, some of these steps were really hard for me to take and were stressful at times. But you want to be well so that you can run your farm business well.
Yeah.
You know? Like, Alana, if you want to talk to that at all.
Yeah, that's actually making me think of something like when you're saying you know, you want to sort of bring in a therapist in part to help your actual business. And then when you said like in the past you felt as though you should be able to handle this on your own, or you felt like a failure because you couldn't, you know, back in the day before I was married to a farmer, I like planted 2 tomato plants and like a couple, you know, kale plants. And I didn't call myself a farmer because I wasn't. You know, I was a gardener with a black thumb for the most part. But same thing is true. Like just because I can plant some tomatoes doesn't mean that I'm a farmer. So just because you can do some things to make yourself feel better doesn't mean that you're your own therapist or that you should be your own therapist. You know, I think it's like we really do need to rely on the folks who have the experience and know what they're doing and are able to share that with you and want to share that with you to help you be well, because boy, it's a lot of work. Like if I had to try to grow all my own food, I would starve. So I assure you, like I am in the right field for me. I hope that all the farmers are in the right field for all of you, but that you know, when you need some help, you shouldn't be expected to do that too. You know, we all are experts. I have a client who says to me all the time, "I'm a teacher. You're a therapist. I don't know how to do what you're doing. You don't know how to do what I'm doing. Like, we each do our own thing." I was like, "Yes, that's right." So, like, you know, it's okay to not be able to do it all. If you're feeling like you can't help yourself feel better on your own, well, that's normal, because who can do it all? So it's okay to call in some professional support if you're feeling like you need it. Just like I imagine most farmers probably have accountants, you know, like, you're not trying to balance your own books. You shouldn't try to be balancing your own brain.
Or somebody that fixes the tractor when it goes haywire. I mean, I am sure that there are some farmers that have taken on electrical problems and plumbing problems and machinery problems that have learned that they need to ask a professional. And it's
Yes.
the same with your mental health and dealing with your stress.
Yeah, for sure.
Because you don't want to get electrocuted by your brain. Is that a good analogy?
That was good. I was gonna say, yeah, we have like we have a running joke about this like old broken down van that Tom is insistent on, like, I could just fix it. And I'm like, you're never gonna fix it. Not gonna do it. But yeah, don't be that old broken down van.
Yeah.
Let a mechanic do it.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely. So, um, yeah. So thank you so much for sitting down with me and doing this.
Yeah, for sure.
Definitely, there are some resources that UConn has at their farm risk website, which I will put in the description of this video when it is put on YouTube. But I know that both Alana and I are open to being contacted after the fact, to, connect and talk about these things and help you find a therapist if that's something you're interested in, or to help you figure out how we can help more farmers with managing their stress. So I'm sure you can reach out to Alana at Truelove Farms, and I'm also at UConn. So, yeah. Alana, any last words, thoughts?
Go to therapy. Can only help.
Yeah.
Yeah. No last words. Thank you, though. I really appreciate you wanting to have this conversation and being willing to do this work, because I do think there are so many folks who really would benefit from just having it, the facade of the fear of what is therapy sort of taken away a bit, stripped away, I hope. So try not to be afraid of it. It's a good thing. It should be a good thing. If it's not the right therapist, or it's not the right fit. Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks so much.